diplomacy will be in some way tech diplomacy, and we might even drop the word tech. It's just a word that helps us understand that new technologies, frontier technologies, are not only shaping our economies, are shaping our societies, are really transforming our world.
Welcome to The Global Lens, Science Diplomacy in Focus. A podcast exploring how science, technology, and strategic partnerships are shaping our world and the diplomacy that brings them together. Now, here is your host, Daniella Sussman.
This episode of The Global Lens, Science Diplomacy in Focus is brought to you by Global Signals, a bi-weekly newsletter for globally minded leaders. Each issue delivers early insights into science, innovation, and diplomacy, covering AI, quantum, biotech, space, and health. You'll find emerging signals, international partnership opportunities, and clear takeaways to stay ahead of what's next across the innovation ecosystem and global diplomacy. Subscribe today through the link in the episode description.
What happens when diplomacy meets the boardroom? As private tech companies redefine global influence, governments and industry need a shared playbook. Today, a pioneer who bridged these worlds in Silicon Valley shares how partnerships, culture, and innovation align the private sector with public good to strengthen international partnerships. I'm joined today by Martin Rauchbauer, senior Austrian diplomat and founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network in Silicon Valley. Martin, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Martin, in your view, what is tech diplomacy in 2025, and how does it build in science diplomacy to engage private sector and tech leaders?
So tech diplomacy is a term that has evolved, I would say, over a period of 15 years. Originally, it was a term used to mirror the tech industry and its rise in our societies around the globe. And one, of course, of the main important epicenters of this rise was Silicon Valley, still is to a certain extent. And the term was used in Silicon Valley by a number of actual diplomats that were posted there. I would say about 10 years ago, that term was used very much in order to define a kind of shift in diplomacy with new actors, new concepts, a new way of thinking that is, I would say, a reflection of the transformation that we are all experiencing around the globe.
What is pushing tech diplomacy forward this year, and how has the government industry dynamic shifted?
I would say that we have in 2025 all experienced a number of conflicts that have been going on for a while, military conflicts and confrontations, but also on the side of trade and economics. There's been a very complicated pictures of different crises around the globe. Some people talk about the poly crisis. And of course, that has an influence on the tech industry and some opportunities there, but some solutions that technologies provide. But of course, also when we think of trade routes and trade relations between various nations, then I think the 2025 is characterized by the multi-crisis that is going on. At the same time, I would say, the breathtaking pace of some of these new frontier technologies is continuing. Societies are adapting to these changes, and so is the international system. And many people point out to the new U.S. administration that took office at the beginning of this year and kind of a re-evaluation of power relations and dynamics between the United States and some of its allies and adversaries. So there's a lot of, attention to that and the role of technology in some of these relationships. So I would say it's a time characterized by technology as being sometimes the driver, sometimes the solution, sometimes the problem, sometimes all of those three things together.
Given these shifts, what do you think who needs to adapt more, diplomats or tech executives or both? And what skills are critical?
Yeah, it's very interesting. My own personal experience in Silicon Valley as a career diplomat. I didn't really have a tech background when I came to Silicon Valley more than 10 years ago. And I experienced some of the, problems that a lot of government officials and in particular diplomats face, which is it's very hard for anybody outside of that world to understand, to keep track, to in some ways respond to the challenges that these new technologies face. On the other hand, I think that diplomats in particular, their profile, they are generalists. They have a big picture view, whether this is in science diplomacy or in any other forms of diplomacy. They come with a big picture view to the problems. And, if you combine that with catching up to some of these gaps that we all face in terms of capacity and training, I think that diplomats sometimes have a very good view, maybe not how technologies work in all details, but what they actually mean, and what they mean particularly for the international system. I think diplomats are valuable. When it comes to industry executives, the decision makers, and sometimes it's the founders, sometimes it's the CEOs, sometimes the shareholders. And when it comes to the very business model that they are in some ways pursuing, they need to also take into account a changing world and adapt and, looking at their own business model, what makes their company tick, what makes their company profitable, and also the potential for the future. I think increasingly in a globalized world, you need to take the international system into account. So they need to adapt as well. Sometimes not just, it's not a nice to have, it's about survival. You need to understand your markets. You need to understand not only the current political situation, but you need to also understand where your company with its supply chains, its customers will maybe in 2 or 3 years, or even in 5 and 10 years. So you have to include a lot of thinking that is the thinking of a changing and world in transformation into your business model. And so I think on both sides, on the side of the government and side of the private sector, and let's not forget on the side of our citizens and civil society, there is unfortunately or fortunately, we live in a time of transformation where everybody needs to be flexible and adapt.
You see a lot of headlines. They often swing between optimism and risk with emerging technologies. How do you keep teams focused on practical outcomes?
I think that, at the end of the day, people in the industry are very pragmatic and they will measure their interactions with government officials, not, when it comes to the niceties of exchanges or polite conversations, but what is in it, for them and what kind of topics can be not only discussed, but solved. And so I think a lot of, things depend on, is there something to talk about? Is there something to solve? Is there a problem to the solution? If tech diplomacy is the solution, what is the actual problem it solves? The second thing is, are the structures that both governments as well as private sector brings to the table, are they adequate to respond to those problems? And I think a lot of countries and a lot of companies have not yet really solved that question, how to structurally respond to this, what I think is a necessary dialogue and a necessary channel of communication. And if at their best, they have established such a line of communication, such a relationship that we could define as a new form of diplomacy or tech diplomacy, and they solve problems. They solve small problems, when it comes to, citizens' concerns that these diplomats ultimately also represent. I've had my own share of experience, and it's good, to have a line of communications to some of these big platforms that, might solve a citizen's problem or citizen's concern. And then, of course, the other aspect of it is governments, of course, can shape in a very big way and need to shape in a very big way the playground, the playing field of technology companies through regulations, standards, laws, even international treaties, conventions, norms, all these kind of things where governments are active. And so that is very important for companies. I often hear from company representatives, that they are not at all against regulations, but they need to have a kind of stable and clear and consistent regulatory environment so that they can operate. For a company, having no regulation is often worse than having regulations, because then they can adapt and they can, they know the environment. And so I think from a company's perspective, they need to understand what is happening. They need to understand what is at stake in different countries. I think a lot of companies also fear, particularly when they operate globally, they fear, a patchwork of different, often opposing, contradictory regulations. And then I think, thirdly, I think that there is also, there are creative ways of engaging with each other that go beyond, this traditional lobbying efforts of companies that try to influence governments, but that are basically trying to, bridge the silos that we all live in. And they go sometimes, even beyond ideological or political or even geopolitical divisions, and look at the common humanity that underlie some of these technological challenges. What does it mean to be a human being in the age of artificial intelligence? Some of these very basic existential questions are touched. And I think their governments, citizens, and scientists, of course, as well as technologists, need to understand each other, talk to each other, and understand the problems and also the possible solutions.
I mean, you have touched on so many different issues, and I feel like we need to have follow-up shows on that. But just for today, if you were to design a crash course for embassies and C-suites to align, what would that cover?
Yeah, I think that, one of the big questions that a lot of governments, face when it comes to their global presence is, is it really still important in the age of Zoom and the age of video conferencing to be actually physically present, at I don't know, in the centers of decision making? That's really the premise of diplomacy for hundreds of years, is that you need a permanent presence at the centers of political power and establish relations, channels of communications that are long-term and that are, consistent, and that are in some ways also independent from, whatever political fashion or ideology governs the time. And my own personal view is, even though a lot of interpersonal relations and relationships in general can be managed digitally and can be managed, through, you travel somewhere and there's a lot of tech diplomats that are kind of roving ambassadors and travel around the world. I do think that it is important to establish a presence. It's important to understand your environment long term and get a real feel for it and have a presence, establish an office. So that's one of the things I think that a country needs to solve. Where am I present? And what kind of structures and what kind of capacity do I bring to my representation? And of course, tech diplomacy also says it's not only political centers of political powers or political decision makings. It's also centers of economic decision making. And so centers, of tech like Silicon Valley, but there are many others around the world. If you send diplomats there, that's kind of a deviation from traditional diplomatic practice. Your counterparts are not diplomats, but are tech executives. And I think you need to also, understand that and prepare your both sides for that. And you can't really use traditional forms of protocol. You need to have people that are extremely flexible, that understand this new world, the etiquettes, and also the cultural aspect about it. And that, I think, is important for a diplomat to be effective, but also for a tech executive to be effective in government relations. So my crash course would be about culture. It would be about being flexible, and it would be also about, you need to, just as much as you need to understand the new environment you're operating in, you also need to understand really well your own environment that is sending you and that you're representing. How can you, effectuate change in your own system in order to be an effective tech diplomat? And that is often the bigger challenge, because a lot of tech diplomats report that they're kind of not just trying to change and make their government's position understood, but also in order to bring change within, bring innovation, bring a new way of thinking into their own structures. And that's a special skill. It's not always possible. Sometimes you need patience. Sometimes you need allies, and you need to understand where those allies are. And I think those would be the main elements I would suggest for a crash course for aspiring tech diplomats.
I mean, your work, in building alignment has been really inspiring, particularly through the Tech Diplomacy Network in Silicon Valley, which you founded in 2023. What gap did it fill then, and what did you build, and what were the key successes that you can share with us?
So I would say when tech diplomacy as a term was used, I said about 10 years ago, 2015, 16, and 2017, Denmark famously appointed a tech ambassador to Silicon Valley for the first time. It was kind of, at the time, people were raising their eyebrows and thought, was that like a publicity stunt, and is that really meaningful? And then a lot of countries, my own Austria, followed suit, and now even the European Union has an office in Silicon Valley, and many other countries use the term tech diplomacy. Originally, mainly from Europe, but now Brazil is a big player in the tech diplomacy world, Japan, South Korea. But really now I would say it's by now a global phenomenon. A lot of countries also from the global south are rethinking, and how they can best represent their country's interest and in what kind of forms. I think the Tech Diplomacy Network was a response to a growing need among countries to go from competition to collaboration. At the very beginning, many countries thought of their representation in Silicon Valley as, what kind of benefits can we, my country, get from having a good network, good contacts into the industry? How can I promote my country? How can I promote the startups, the innovators? How can I get access to, the newest trends, the newest technologies? And that remains, for all countries, a prerogative. But I think many countries understood after a while that there's so many things that countries have in common and that are better addressed collaboratively, that there were at the beginning kind of informal ways of collaboration, which I was part of. And there, many more that have come up in the meantime. And the Tech Diplomacy Network really was one of those initiatives that tried to establish kind of some more conceptual clarity of what tech diplomacy as a practice actually is, but also provide a platform for all those countries that were looking for collaboration and spread that new form of diplomacy, which we believe will not just be a subset of diplomacy, like a type of diplomacy, but in the end, we actually think that in the future, all diplomacy will be in some way tech diplomacy, and we might even drop the word tech. It's just a word that helps us understand that new technologies, frontier technologies, are not only shaping our economies, are shaping our societies, are really transforming our world, but are also heavily influencing and shaping all forms of diplomacy. And tech diplomacy is just a useful term of raising this awareness. So it was a platform, it was a network, it was also a way to link this practice to the academic world, to research, the think tanks, to think, have bright people think about what is actually happening and provide access for that. And of course, also to engage in capacity building. There's a lot of diplomatic academies, a lot of training centers within foreign services, but also, for young aspiring diplomats that want to engage in digitalization, that want to engage in new technologies. Sometimes, the students don't need much training because they are full into these new technologies and know a lot about it. I've personally taught for many years now a course at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna around new technologies, and it's a really interesting experience also, how rapidly also the diplomats of the future are adapting and are changing. And I think what it means to be a diplomat is very different now than it was 10 years ago. And it'll certainly be very different 10 years from now.
I was reading actually an article that how every company is now a technology company. And as you said, the new generation, younger generation, obviously they're more adapting much faster. I just remember the conversation we had. You talked about the Silicon Valley's unique ecosystem culture. Based on your experience, what can other regions learn from Silicon Valley's culture?
One of the things that is something, it's become almost like a cliche and a political term, in all these cultural wars that are going on in many countries, and that's the issue of diversity. It's become from a very positive word, like to a word that people shy away from, unfortunately. I think there you can really objectively look at the fact of the positive role that a certain type of diversity has played in Silicon Valley. I always was struck by the fact that more than 50% of the workforce in Silicon Valley was born not only outside of Silicon Valley, but outside of the United States. And that means that, a lot of talent around the world was and has been and will be attracted to that very dynamic, innovative regions. And I think one of the interesting things is that despite this diversity, people from all around the world coming together, there seems to be, through the kind of people it attracts, highly talented, super achievers, it creates kind of an own unique, homogeneous culture that also has its dark sides. By the way, I mean there's also a gender imbalance there, and certain aspects of this culture certainly needed also to improve and to change. But I was always very impressed about Silicon Valley, that with this diversity that benefited it, the brightest minds from around the culture, it created a really dynamic culture with its own values, with its own rules, with its own etiquettes that are essentially about openness, about paying forward, about, encouraging people to come up with their crazy ideas and not give up, and also to risk and to risk to fail. And I think that is something that countries can learn. Not everything about Silicon Valley is repeatable. Not everything should be imitated. There's also, things that come from there which are highly questionable and have been questioned, and rightly so. And there's also, we have to also think about Silicon Valley by itself, having its own demons that it is dealing with, this initial euphoria at the tech boom of, these young entrepreneurs that founded startups that would, engage in exponential growth and change the world. And this is a kind of this rosy picture of optimism and innovation has, of course, I wouldn't say been replaced, but at least we need to now also think of the big, global behemoths, the big global monopolies of the platforms that in some ways are met with anxieties. If, there's a lot of concerns about these platforms having too much power, about the impact of these new technologies, particularly when it comes to social media, the impact that these new technologies like AI have on our societies, particularly on the younger people. So we need to look very carefully about what innovation really means. I think we are looking carefully, and I think we need to adapt the flexibility in mind and not to reject fully or to embrace fully. I think we need to both embrace what is great and reject what is not great. And I think that is the kind of lesson the rest of the world should take from Silicon Valley. Always be ready to change, always be ready to, adapt. That's the kind of mindset that will be unfortunately necessary for every country, for every region around the world.
So in 2023, you created this network. Since then, as you mentioned, emerging technology transformation has accelerated. What would you add to the network now in 2025?
I think that what we really kind of need nowadays is to measure more carefully the pace of innovation and really also look at what kind of impact some of the technologies have on our different societies and measure that, and not just talk about it and not just, make optimistic or super pessimistic predictions, but to in some ways measure the impact, measure innovation better, measure the readiness of governments better. And that is kind of a little bit my dream, that not just my network, but that we just get a better sense of, where innovation is going on a macro level, on a big picture level. And so that, this is not just about different mood swings that we all undergo as societies or, different ideological fashions that go back and forth, but that we kind of have a very pragmatic, measured and, neutral approach to technologies, look at what is good and what is necessary, look at them as a source for solutions and find the right regulations where they're needed and measure that and have that based on facts. It's hard because even the facts that you measure, they change all the times, and there's there's concerns that we have about, for example, a generative AI, and then sometimes they're overblown, and then a year later we say, was this all a hype? That and all these fears have not materialized, and then we realize, but there are actually different kind of problems that these new technologies have brought that we haven't even thought about at the beginning when we were all so nervous and so scared. So I think there has to be a constant measurement, a constant research on the effect of these new technologies, to also give governments a break, to give governments some sort of tools to assess, to analyze, to also answer to their citizens, and to give a sort of measured, optimistic, but also, responsible compass for where to guide our planet in the future, without extreme fears and without a naive optimism, but measured, fact-based approaches. And I think that tech diplomacy could be, one of those instruments of measurement of the future, of where we should all go, in order to formulate visions for our political leaders. And that is what I would love the Tech Diplomacy Network also to be part of.
When it comes to practical things for embassies and ministries tuning in, What is one practical first step, and what is a common misstep in your opinion?
I think that one of the things that I learned in Silicon Valley is that innovation is, it's a buzzword. Maybe even tech diplomacy is a buzzword. So many of the concepts of the words we use nowadays can be misused as buzzwords. It's just, words that you float around and that sound good for a while, and then you get disappointed because they don't really mean much. The same is true about innovation in general. There's so many legacy companies, have established a presence in centers of innovation. So many governments have done that, innovation centers and innovation outposts. But the real trick is, how do you really integrate innovation into your whole system? The problem is you can't isolate, you can't put innovation into a silo in order to perform it, for everybody to feel good. It is something that needs to come into your entire organization, into your entire society. And I think that is something that politicians, that even bureaucrats and, industry leaders often forget. We need to live for the long term. We need to work. We need to shape the infrastructure for the long term and not just for the short term effect. And so the mistakes can be, to do something that looks good for the moment, but has no real meaning for the whole. That is true sometimes. I've seen that, also in government bureaucracies, that you build an office or you appoint somebody here and there, but it's not meaningful. It doesn't really reflect the long-term change. But I think at the same time, we are seeing this change happening on all levels and in different levels. There's certainly a change of the mindset that has been going on in many, many different regions around the world. People do understand that they, whenever, in whatever context you talk about diplomacy, about international relations, about a vision for the future, you need to talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and new technologies as part of that solution. And I think tech diplomacy for sure has been an important element of this change.
I want to move to something unique. Your experience isn't obviously limited to diplomacy. While you lived in Silicon Valley, you later served as the executive director of the Jurassic Residence Artist Program. You led international artists in residence initiatives, focusing on creativity at the intersection of art, nature, and technology. How do artists and quantum innovators provide a unique perspectives for policy and industry, in your opinion?
I think that artists are really interesting in that, when artists are ultimately kind of when you look at their mindset and when they're very good, they are not unlike entrepreneurs. They are kind of risk takers. They do it for the sake of it. They engage in projects where the outcome is uncertain. They often don't really, they ask artistic questions and don't really know where they will lead them. So they're risk takers. And I was always intrigued by Silicon Valley as, some call it, the cradle of a new renaissance, or as a new, as a new center of also cultural innovation and rejuvenation. And so I was always interested in what does that mean for the artists' world? How do artists react to this? And obviously, there is good artists. There is, artists that, use these new technologies to create amazing new work. There are artists that don't really resonate that much with these new technologies. So I was always fascinated by how artists not only show us how these new technologies work, but also maybe how they don't work, or look at these new technologies in unexpected ways. So precisely because they are not necessarily bound to any specific outcomes. And so for me, artists and technologists, they should work together more. And I think also technologists are creative in nature and not look at each other, as if they were from two different worlds, but maybe, this concept of what it means to be a creative person can also, blur, and it becomes kind of less important. The future might be the artist technologist in one person. And I've just met over the course of the last years amazing artists that ask questions that are also relevant for science and for technology in general. I think it's particularly interesting when scientists, technologists, and artists work together collaboratively. I think that in some ways, the way art is going, the art world, it's a lot about collaboration. It's a lot about experimentation. And there's a lot of excitement. The usual trenches between industry and society are maybe not as pronounced and precarious in the art world. So they can do also a lot of things because they're kind of, free, truly free. So I always felt that, in some of these big questions of our times, we should revert to artists and support them and bring artists maybe even into the research labs of technology companies and not wreak havoc, but to, inspire and to expand our minds. And that was something that I also experienced in this artist residency program that I had the privilege to lead over the last 3 years. It was kind of in the vicinity of Silicon Valley, close to Stanford University, and some of the programs we would really bring together literally artists, innovators, scientists to collaborate on programs. I will just bring one example. Was really intrigued by an artist from the UK, that Edie Fung, that was fascinated in quantum technology and came to our program in Silicon Valley and required and asked us for a quantum computer. Now, as you know, quantum computers are not maybe quite ready yet to be used, but there are some sort of hybrid forms around, and we managed to connect this artist with a hybrid quantum computer. And then the artist started to essentially produce music that was based on the concept of randomness that quantum computers are supposed to make possible, unlike algorithmic computers. And it was theoretically really interesting, because then you start thinking about agency and you start thinking about the free will, both within human beings as well as without, with non-human beings. But it was also just really beautiful to listen to the music that was kind of produced, so to speak, in this collaborative effort between a quantum computer and an artist. And it was innovative. It was very interesting for the technologist of that company that we brought along. And I think that's the kind of ideal scenario where you bring an artist into the picture and things happen, both artistically, both technologically, and it's just really fun to be part of it and watch that.
I think it's really fascinating when you talk so passionately about the intersection of art, technology, and innovation, just creating new perspectives and possibly, great ways to collaborate. I want to zoom out a bit again to the broader impact of tech diplomacy. What value can government industry tech diplomacy bridge create? I know you talked about some of the opportunities, but obviously there are challenges in this type of collaboration. And I wanted to get your input based on your experience and what you're seeing some of these challenges might be.
So I think the challenges are really in this kind of delicate collaboration just simply not working. It's unlike diplomats meeting other diplomats. This has been a practice that's been established over centuries. There's an entire wealth of of protocols, of ways of doing it that have, a lot of centuries of people have been thinking about it, and you don't have to think much about how to address, how to talk to, how to engage with another diplomat of another country. There's just ways of doing that. Tech diplomacy, as I said, is a new practice, and it involves new actors that are not used to that, and where there's a need for change on both sides. We said that before. So, the challenges really are, what does it mean in practice? What are kind of really the concrete outcomes so that this becomes meaningful for everybody involved? There's also, the challenge of whom do you talk to when you are a tech diplomat and you want to establish a relationship with a tech company that has 10,000s of employees, and you don't want to really engage with people that engage ultimately in some sort of higher level of public relations, that ultimately just want to please you or leave a good impression on you, but you want to actually have the right counterparts, the actual decision makers. And that's not easy. All these people have little time, and they also need to be convinced that, it makes sense to talk to a government representative and not directly to, the actual government leaders. Often prime ministers and presidents talk directly with founders and CEOs of big platforms. So these kind of practices are still in the making. There's been relatively, when we look at the history of diplomacy, relatively little time. And therefore, I even think the need for collaboration and exchange between countries that engage in diplomacy is more necessary than ever. You need to work together. You need to understand this shifting landscape, this transformation process together. And I think you need to also think of not just tech diplomacy as a practice in centers of innovation, but as a kind of horizontal new form of diplomacy. Therefore, I think, wherever you are around the world, in whatever representation, embassy, consulate you're posted, you need to bring this kind of thinking along. And I remember that I was once talking to a high-level State Department official in the previous U.S. administration, it was Ambassador Nathaniel Fick, who was the U.S. cyber ambassador, and he had this very ambitious vision of bringing technology diplomats in every single U.S. representation around the world. And I think that the challenge there, obviously, is that it requires a real big transformation process at a time where governments face, shortages and a huge pressure to reduce capacity and not to build new capacities. So there's that. We're also at a time where every dime is turned around many times, and where expanding or, creating new capacities is problematic. It's difficult. And so I think at the same time, young diplomats have a very different view about this new world than older generations. And I think this transformation process is inevitable, and it'll come from all sides. And I think when I just look at, the selection process of young diplomats nowadays, at least in my country, has changed. There's a big encouragement of people with a STEM background, with a technology background, to apply and to become part of the foreign service. So I think this transformation process is inevitable. It's happening right in front of our eyes. And I think that ultimately it will show that diplomacy is not a kind of anachronistic thing of the past in a world that no longer needs it. I think it is a necessary transformation process of a practice that is now needed more than ever. I think we are heading towards a planet that is going to have more and more conflicts, unfortunately, and more need for, creating interfaces between different narratives, between different ideologies, between different geopolitical blocks and camps. And diplomacy will be needed more than ever. So will be new technologies to save and to bring remedies to some of these biggest challenges that we are facing, like climate change and the lack of resources. And so I think that if we look at the solutions of the future, we also need to look at the tools that we will need in order to come to these solutions. New technologies are certainly a big part of it, and I think diplomacy as a tool is another big part of it.
Absolutely. I think, our conversation should continue. But just for today, as we wrap up, I want to get your insights, like a quick series of questions. Obviously, you shared about the new generation of diplomats, but any additional advice to diplomats who are new to a tech hub?
The advice would be something that I didn't hear today. Don't dress up like a diplomat. Get rid of your tie and dive really into the culture. Dive really into the ecosystem of where you're posted at. Sometimes diplomats, I would say very few, make the mistakes that they only mingle with other diplomats. That's not a good path, to be a good tech diplomat. You need to really understand the place you're in and in some ways adopt some of the mindset of it and go to meetups, go to meet entrepreneurs, get excited, become a bit of a tech nerd, get into these new applications and try to understand the newest thing, even if it's just a hype or a fashion and it'll be replaced by the next new thing. But you need to get excited. You need to be passionate in order for yourself to enjoy the job, in order to be taken seriously, and in order to actually really produce meaningful work. But I think there is no lack of that. I think I myself am not, super young, but I do think that talking to young diplomats nowadays makes me very confident that this change is happening and it will be permanent.
Great advice for diplomats. What about the other side of the table? Advice for founders, navigating regulation. What is your advice?
My advice is there's sometimes with youth and with success and there's sometimes a little bit a danger of overconfidence and a little bit of superficiality. There's this bravado of changing the world and that's kind of good. I like the vibe, I like the attitude, but the world is complicated and it's okay to admit it. And sometimes it does make sense to use a little bit the caution of government, even bureaucrats. It's there for good reason, and it can make all the difference in your own success or failure. So thinking of the world as complicated and complex and embracing complexity rather than trying to simplify everything, which is, you need a bit of both. You should certainly not let complications hinder you in your innovative drive. But there are moments where you just also need to recognize that things are complex and, that it does make sense to study other countries, other cultures, respect that, and it'll actually serve you in the long run.
That's a very practical guidance. What is an idea or an experiment you recommend for foreign ministries they should try in the next 6 months?
I think that there is a good reason why governments are structurally, I'm not saying politically or ideologically, but structurally conservative. It's ultimately governments need to be predictable, they need to be steady, they need to in some ways, it's also not, it's not venture capital that is funding governments, it's taxpayers' money. So there's good reasons that there are these kind of a little bit sometimes boring, a little bit, cautious types in charge. However, I think that we live in a time of transformation. So governments need to do this trick of creating playgrounds, of creating maybe, places of circumference, and maybe, places where they do experiment. And so I would say, I would advise governments to allow that, to think outside of the box. Not always, the caution can be good, but I think innovation, experimentation is necessary nowadays. And I think not just foreign ministries, but every kind of ministry needs to create such spaces where they allow experimentation and sandboxes, so to speak, of bureaucracy, maybe even of regulatory sandboxes, where they try out things that can also go wrong. And then you learn from that and you move on. That's very contrary to how many bureaucrats think. But I do think that there's also a lot of hunger and a lot of passion within bureaucracies for what they're doing. And if they truly love their trade and their craft, they will be open to improve it.
You talked about Silicon Valley culture. I was just wondering, what is one habit diplomats could borrow from Silicon Valley?
I think it is this relentless drive forward, just not to get held down, not by constraints. Again, I think the constraints are there for good reason, but sometimes, when you are in a big company or in a big government, in a big structure, where you sometimes feel like a little wheel in a big machinery, you sometimes think, it doesn't really matter what I do, it's insignificant. And in Silicon Valley, it's the opposite. The people think single-handedly they're going to change the world, right? It's what keeps them going. And I always was fascinated by that optimism, by that drive. It's sometimes delusional and it's sometimes overblown, but I think the energy that comes with it, to actually really relentlessly and consistently work on an idea, and, be open to it, open yourself up, make yourself vulnerable also to failure, to critique, to feedback, to whatever, is something very beautiful that you learn in Silicon Valley, but that you learn in every, place where there are startups, where there are entrepreneurs, where there are people who want to experiment and want to try out new things. I think that is something very beautiful and that I think can be injected and transferred to all realities we live in.
Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to add or share with our audience?
I personally think that we live in a time of anxiety, of a collective kind of anxiety. We watch the world and sometimes it's overwhelming just to read the news. There's a crisis here, and then in addition, it's not over, and yet you have to deal with the next crisis, and some of them seem really apocalyptic and really make us question our belief systems. So my advice is to have, faith in human ingenuity and in not a naive faith, not an uncritical faith, but some sort of faith that we can do it. That's something I learned particularly from, people, not just from Silicon Valley, but from people from around the world that are future oriented and that don't see the future as a big dystopian horror, but is ultimately full of potential, full of possibilities. The world is full of possibilities. And so are all and each of our individual lives. And that kind of faith is something beautiful. It's something that is beautiful to watch with other people. It's beautiful to discover within oneself.
Wow, that's a powerful ending here, Martin. Thank you for joining us. I hope our conversation will continue.
What a pleasure to talk to you, Daniella, and I really want to thank for this inspiring conversation.
Thank you. And to everyone, if you're listening, please subscribe to The Global Lens for exclusive insights on science, innovation, and diplomacy. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
You've been listening to The Global Lens, Science, Diplomacy, in Focus. To hear more conversations at the intersection of science, policy, and international partnerships, subscribe to The Global Lens on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and over 30 platforms around the globe. Send us your ideas and guest suggestions to Daniella@globallenspodcast.com.